There is no doubt that we live in a time when the Christian faith is in retreat, at least in Western Europe. Okay, in this country where we live in Western Europe, it's in retreat. And there was a time when the Christian faith was the kind of the staple of philosophy and ideologies and of all the sort of big ideas that people had about life and about the way that we should live. The Christian faith, it was like the foundation. It was the foundation of our societies, it's of our law and all these things. And really it permeates every part of our being. But this last century, or the previous century and this century, our Christian foundations have been under attack. I don't mean necessarily in a malicious way, though that might be the case, but through all sorts of developments in the society in which we live, technology, new ideas, advances in academics and all these things, the Christian faith has been really treated as, when you take the Bible, as just another ordinary document. It's been assessed just like academics would assess any other document. They've studied it like you would study any other document. And the problem with that is the Bible is not like any other document. So if you treat it just like any other bit of writing that you might read, then you're going to come up with wrong results. I'll just give you one example. When it comes to dating the Gospel of Matthew, the scholars, people in universities and that write PhDs and all these things on it, many of them, because they treat the Bible just like any other piece of writing, they date the Gospel of Matthew post 70 AD, when it's written as though it was written much earlier than that. Why would they do that? Well, here's the reason why. Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They say that didn't happen until 70 AD, therefore it cannot have been written until after 70 AD because no one knew it was going to happen. Do you see? There's lots of evidence to suggest that says that it was written earlier, but that one thing sways most scholars. Basically, they say, their thinking is there is nothing divine about the scriptures. Therefore, anything that would appear divine, there's got to be another explanation. That's just one way which the Christian faith has been eroded. And that kind of thinking is spread from the academy down to right the way down through every part of society. So that today, relatively few people trust and believe in God. Many people have this idea that Christianity has been tried, tested and found wanting. It's kind of failed. Another religion, often they say, like all the other religions that have been proved to be a load of rubbish, you can put Christianity in with that. Well, we're going to watch a short video, and I chose this video because it sums up many people's problems with the idea of God. And this is a celebrity and something of, he's respected as someone who has great academic ability. Some people would say he's a bit of a genius. Some people would refer to him as a national treasure, I think. He's a very likeable person, and his name is Stephen Fry. Okay, I hope we all know Stephen Fry. Well, just have a watch of this video and listen to what he says, and we're going to address this in our message. And we're going to think through some of what he says, because what he says there is how many people struggle with the idea of God. We're also going to look, I'm going to read a few verses from the book of Job. And the reason why I've chosen these verses, we're going to read them now, we're going to come back to them towards the end of the message. But the reason why I've chosen these verses is because Job is the story of a godly man, of a righteous God, but also of a man that suffered tremendously and yet honoured God, continued in faith. So just after all of his sufferings, Job, and he's been kind of, Job and his friends have been spouting off about God, saying what they think, and then they're confronted by God. The question for Stephen Fry was, what would you do if, you found yourself going through the pearly gates? In other words, you're about to be confronted by God. And Stephen, his first question for God would be, bone cancer in children? How dare you? Well, this is Job's words. It says this, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. And then for the next 2 chapters, God asked those sorts of questions. Where were you? The Lord said to Job, this is in chapter 40, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. And I just want to pause there, because isn't that what Stephen Fry was doing really in his tirade? How dare you, he said, create a world where there is such misery, which is not our fault. That's what he said. That's an accusation. How dare you do this? Let him who accuses God answer him. And this is Job's answer. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And then in Job chapter 42, verses 1 to 3. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand. And the great thing about that story is Job did speak about things he didn't understand, and God was merciful and gracious towards him. And I just wanted to remind us of that aspect, because maybe as Stephen Fry was speaking, was thinking, the nerve of it, how dare he, Maybe we might have taken a bit of offence at what he said. But let's not do that. Let's listen and try and respond and try and understand where he's coming from, because what he says reflects a lot of people. Well, I think the first thing that I would want to say in response to what Stephen Fry says is this. I agree with him. Everything that he says, pretty much, I would have to put my hand on his shoulder and say, I agree. I agree. What kind of a God does that? But there's a major problem with all of what he says, and that is this. He is not talking at all about the Christian God. I don't know if you noticed, look at what he says. How dare you create a world in which there is such misery? Then he goes on to talk about those particular things, terrible things. And they are terrible things. But the accusation is God has created that world. Well, if you're going to annihilate the idea of God, the Christian God, and that's the God that he's speaking about, because the question is, when you're at the pearly gates, that's the phrase that's used. So this is the Christian God, that's a phrase used about the Christian heaven, as it were. Then it's the Christian God you have to deal with. And the Christian God did not create a world full of misery. The Bible says quite the opposite. In Genesis chapter 1, if Stephen Fry actually said those words, firstly, if he was confronted by God, he'd probably be gobsmacked. But secondly, if he did say that, how dare you create a world in which there is such misery? God, if he was willing to be gracious, which he often is, may say something like this. Haven't you read Genesis chapter 1, Stephen? The first chapter of the Bible, where I tell you what I did. I created a world that is good. In one chapter, 6 times, God says that what he created was good and very good. And that means there was nothing about it that was bad. Nothing. There was no injustice, no pain, no eye-eating diseases, no bone marrow cancer, nothing. None of that. When you look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the picture of God's creation is beautiful. Stephen Fry would love to live there, and so would we all. We see there the world that we all want. Everyone wants to live in that world. Well, that's the world that God created, the world that we all want. And just a cursory read of the first chapter in the Bible makes that clear. So we could tell that to Stephen Fry and anyone else that says, what kind of God creates such a world? We could say, well, that's not the Christian God, but I agree with you, that wouldn't be a very good God. Then we could smugly walk away, having won the argument, and put that one to bed. But we're not about winning arguments. And, we want to be of more generous heart, I would hope, than that. Because even though Stephen Fry is addressing what you might call a straw man of a God, he's also expressing and articulating very, very well how people feel. And also the confusion that many people have about God. There are lots of people that have cried out to God in their suffering. They've come to that point where it's like, well, if he's up there, maybe, and they'll cry out to him. Like, knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. And yet the door seemed to be firmly closed. No answer. And they conclude, well, if there's a God up there, what kind of God is he? And if we are a little bit more generous to Stephen Fry, we could rephrase his question. Something like this. How dare you, God, create a world in which you knew there would be such misery, which is not our fault. It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Well, that's a different prospect, isn't it? Because God, when he created that beautiful paradise, knew how things were going to turn out. God wasn't ignorant of that. And so you could say we're not quite off the hook from that perspective, at least. So, how do we answer that? How could God have created a world? Okay, he created it beautiful, but one where he knew that these terrible things were going to happen. Well, here's the first thing that I'd say to anyone that may be watching this that doesn't yet know the Lord, or you think that God is so completely unreasonable, without at all denying that there is terrible, terrible wickedness and evil in the world, and there is. And I know that some of us have experienced some of that, some of the pain of it. If we haven't, we've only got to live long enough, haven't we? But, so notwithstanding that, even so, here's a relevant fact, okay, that may not appear relevant at first, but there is an estimated 10.5 out of 100,000 people commit suicide. Okay, out of every 100,000 people, 10.5 people commit suicide. It's basically about 1 in 10,000 people. And why is that relevant? Well, because what it means is this. Out of every 10,000 people, 9,999 would say that this world and my life, with all that's wrong with it, with all the evil, life is still worth living. It's still worth living. Stephen Frost says, what kind of a God? Well, another way of phrasing that is this. what kind of a God creates a life where there's a mixture of good and evil, but there's enough good in my life to really make it worth living? 9,999 against 1 voting for life. That's not an insignificant factor in this equation. In fact, Stephen Fry says, doesn't he? He says, if there is a God, he really is evil, but... Sorry, he says that this... here it is. He says this: the moment you banish him, that's God, the world becomes simpler and more worth living, in my opinion. In other words, without God, people like Stephen Fry think that life is more worth living than if someone has faith in God. Now, I have faith in God, and I think life is really worth living. So Stephen Fry, he's not having a bad life. And most people, or many people, are not having such a bad life. And those that do find that their faith in God helps them and gives them purpose and meaning. Without God, they would feel their life is not worth living. So the world in which we live, by Stephen Fry's own admission, is a life worth living. So Stephen Fry is kind of like saying, if there is a God, he is really evil, but the good that he has given me is so good that even with all the terrible evil, as terrible as it is, and he acknowledges that, it's still worth living. I've got so much good to be thankful for, but I don't want to thank him. That's kind of what he's saying, isn't it? If there is a God, he says, then he would make these accusations. But in the same breath, a couple of sentences later, he's acknowledging that he has much good in his life. And that is just to say that we have to keep it in perspective, the question of good and evil and suffering in the world. So that's a perspective. But here's another point that we need to make. Stephen Fry says, how dare you create a world in which you knew there would one day be such misery, we adapted it slightly in his favour, which is not our fault. In other words, Stephen Fry is saying it's all God's fault. It's all God's fault. And the problem with that is that, again, he is then not dealing with the God of the Bible. Whatever God he's rubbishing, you might be able to rubbish Zeus and all these other gods. Well, we would rubbish all those gods. And the God that Stephen Fry is sketching out for us is a God that I would agree with. I would agree with Stephen Fry on it. But the Bible is clear. God, it's not God's fault. It's not God's fault. It's our fault. Okay, so it says, this is in Genesis chapter 2. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat of it, you will certainly die. So he's telling Adam and Eve, the first humans, that they've got everything, basically, the whole world, this beautiful paradise, actually a garden, beautiful paradise garden. This would have been more like a national park than a garden, I guess. But they've got this amazing, beautiful place, a place where the animals come to them, and he gets to exercise his freedom of will and names the animals. And God is very happy to accept the choices that Adam makes. But what a wonderful place, full of low-hanging fruit, just there to be picked. But then in chapter 3, we read this. And God warns him, do not eat, here's the one thing, just one thing. Do not eat from the fruit in the middle of the garden, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When you eat of it, you will certainly die. So he's warned what happens when he eats that fruit. Genesis chapter 3, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realised they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They disobeyed God. They broke his commands. And notice what it says. God warned them, when you do it, you will die. You will become like one of us, knowing good and evil. When you eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You know, the fruit that they ate, it wasn't that it was a bad fruit. It wasn't like an evil. It was by eating of the fruit, they experienced a knowledge. They came to know rebellion. They came to know what it is to defy and deny the God of the universe. It was like waving their fists, these tiny little creatures waving their fists at the Almighty. You know, it's very hard to kind of draw analogies, but it would be a bit like a tiny little ant waving its fist at me, telling me, you know, I don't need you. I can defy you. And I've warned that ant, you know, if you do that, I'm just going to squish you, just like that. And God could have done that. He could have just squished Adam and Eve. It would have been nothing in terms of being hard for God, physically. But, you know, when Adam and Eve ate that fruit, it's like they took a spanner and threw it into the works of all of creation. All the cogs, as it were, that keep everything in harmony with God ruling and reigning over it, all sustaining it, maintaining the harmony. It's like they threw a spanner in the works. Everything, all of creation, was from that moment on kind of doomed. So that we read in Romans chapter 8, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. In other words, when they sinned, they threw that spanner into the works. The whole of creation was in bondage to decay and ruin. The whole of creation. Now, here's the thing. Now, as I say this, like, you know, maybe there'll be people that watch this that think, yeah, but I don't believe all that. For our purposes now, that doesn't really matter. What matters is this. This is the God of the Bible. This is the story that needs to be kind of exposed as false if you're going to expose the Christian God. You can't do it, you know, Stephen Fry hasn't touched this God. Okay? And here's the thing. You might say, okay, well, Adam and Eve sinned, and they brought about this sort of chaos. But that's their problem. That's not my bad. Well, the problem is this. In Romans chapter 3, we read, and we know it's true, for all have sinned. All. You know, we can point the finger at them, but are we saying that we'd have done any better? Do we really think that? We have the choice now, don't we? We choose to sin often. And just as the warning was given to Adam, it says in Romans chapter 6, the wages of sin is death. And by death it means all that comes with it. It's the fruit of sin. God created a perfect world and created this beautiful paradise garden, put Adam and Eve in it where they were safe. And he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And we can have confidence about this, that as they multiplied and began to outgrow the garden, they were to subject, it says, the earth to themselves. God would have enabled them to rule over every acre of land that they took as they expanded and grew. In other words, Eden would have been, the frontiers of Eden, the Garden of Eden, would have been pushed out all over the world. Now this is important because here's the other thing. The Bible tells us when Adam and Eve sinned, they brought sin upon themselves, judgment came upon themselves. We have all sinned, the wages of sin is death. But here's, the whole of creation is subject to ruin and decay. But here's the other thing. After sinning, God banished them from the Garden of Eden, that place of safety. Now I don't know. Maybe outside the Garden of Eden there were eye-burrowing worms. Or maybe there were all sorts of things that would have been dangerous. But in where they were safe. They had all the privileges that God had given them. But they rejected God's rule and reign. And so he said, okay, then you reject my care for you, my special care for you. You want to make it on your own, you go and do it on your own. And so this is the God that we have to deal with is the Christian God. A God that created a good world that we messed up. Stephen Fry also says this: why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice? So that would suggest that Stephen Fry wants a God who does justice, doesn't it? His complaint is, this is an unjust God. Well, any thinking Christian will know this, that the last thing that any unbeliever really should be crying out for is a God who will do justice on them, as it were. Because what is God to do? He's created this world. He gave man everything. Man has rejected God, ruined God's world. Well, God could have just squished them right at the beginning, done away with it. That would have been just. He did say, didn't he? If you do this, you will die. He warns us all, but he allows us to live. Why does God do that? Well, let me just read one other statement he makes that ties in with this. He says this: you could easily have made a creation in which that eye-burrowing disease, etc., didn't exist. God, you could have easily have made a creation where that didn't exist. Well, we have to ask though, could he? Why did God create the world the way that he did? Well, because God wanted to create man in his image. And God, the Christian God, is a Trinitarian God, a triune God. Father, Son and Holy Spirit. And the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit have been in an unbroken relationship of love for all eternity. And so when he created man in his image, he created man to love one another and to love God and to be loved by God. And God does love those that he created. And here's the thing. Because God created a world where man would live and love him and have the freedom to love him, he had to give that freedom. You see, the only way that God could have created a world without the suffering that we see, where a world where it's guaranteed there would never be suffering, the only way that God could have done that is to create human beings, to create me and you in such a way that we cannot rebel against God in any way, where we have to love him. He could have hardwired us and programmed us like robots. So God could have created a world where there is guaranteed to never be any suffering, but here's the problem: I wouldn't be me and you wouldn't be you. We wouldn't be human. And so it's impossible. Stephen Fry's demand is impossible. Stephen Fry would not want to be forced, as it were, or to not have any choice but to have to love God, to have to accept him. Stephen Fry would say that is a tyrannical God. There's no escape from him. I can't deny him. I can't, Nobody wants that God. Nobody. So God couldn't easily, it's a contradiction in terms that God could have created a world with me and you in it without all the suffering. It's impossible. And by the way, that's not an argument that I came up with. This has been debated, philosophers and theologians have thought about this for many, many years. And but the opposition, as it were, have never come up with a world, the idea of a world that would be better than the world we've got, with humans in it that could freely love God. Or not, as the case might be. But back to Stephen. He wants a God who is just. Now here's the problem. God is just. And so, and he hates injustice and evil. The Bible, from beginning to end, is clear about this. I'll just read a couple of verses from Isaiah. Wash and make, this is God speaking to people, wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. He hates evil. Stop doing wrong, God says. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fathers. Plead the case of the widow. In Genesis 18, Abraham says to him, far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? God is committed to justice and righteousness and to goodness, to doing right. And if we demand justice of God, then God would have to punish us. We've rejected God, the only one who can keep the universe in perfect harmony. That's why the universe isn't in perfect harmony. Now we live in a deeply broken world that is both splendid, as Stephen Fry says, but also terribly broken because we broke it. We find ourselves living in this broken world in which we all sin, so that we are all both victims, and some are more victim than others, I know that's true. We're all victims of the sharp end of other people's sin, but we are all also perpetrators of sin. What is a righteous God to do? He cannot just sweep it all under the carpet. He has no desire to hardwire us so that we have no choice but to conform. There's no desire to do that. What should he do? What could he do? Well, here's a better question to ask. What has he done? Because he's done something. This God that so many people misunderstand and reject, because they reject him because they think he's so terrible. It turns out, if the Christian story is true, we've got it all wrong. That actually we're the ones that have caused all the problems. We're the ones that got ourselves banished from Eden. Here's what God has done in response. John chapter 3, the famous verses. For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. What does God do? He acts to save us from our sinfulness, to save us from our guilt, to save us from the consequences of rejecting him. This is what God does. And he does it at cost, great cost, to himself. The Bible says this, that when Jesus saw the crowds, it says he was moved with compassion. In other words, when he looks and sees the dilemma and plight that people are in, he can't be passive. He has to do something. And when God looked down from heaven, as it were, on the earth and sees our lostness, our foolishness, our brokenness, our rebellion, he's moved. So moved that he came into this world. And he came into this world for two reasons. One, to show us the love of the Father in the life that he lived. The love and the righteousness and the goodness. And so he carried on a ministry of healing. Every single person that came to Jesus, every single one got healed. Not one person walked away unhealed. He just healed anyone that came to him, he healed them. That poor child with that eye-burrowing disease, had that person come to Jesus, they'd have been healed. Now I know that you might say, yeah, but where's all that healing now? Yeah, lots of people come to Jesus now, don't they? They're not healed. And that's true. But when Jesus did that, he was showing and demonstrating that the God that they reject is the only God that can help. And his promise and his guarantee is that everyone who comes to him will be healed. It's not a cop-out to say that we will be healed fully in the life to come. That's what the Bible teaches. It's not a cop-out. You see, think about it. If everyone, just like Jesus, the reason he healed everyone was to show people that he can do that. He's got the power to do it. He's got the will to do it. But if he just went around, if everyone got sickness and got healed, that God would become like a kind of dispenser of healing. You know, you put your slot in, you come to him, you get healing, you just go in. People would have no regard for God. No regard whatsoever. They just treat him like a slot machine. I've come to you, give me the healing, thank you very much, see you later. And remember, God wants to have a love relationship with his people.